All right. Welcome to another episode of this podcast I'm doing here. Um, Today, this time, we've got Daniel Tutt with me, and he's written some books. Nietzsche, just generally is a fairly prominent figure on the left. And he has his own show where he talks to authors, intellectuals, and just generally tries to educate people, which I really appreciate. And so I've invited Daniel on because Daniel is, alongside Chris, I would say, Chris Cutrone, is the most influential figure I found on the left in the last few months. I always say I'm a liberal. I'm not convinced of leftism yet, but I have found in the last few months that I have a much more coherent and sympathetic view of leftism. And I would say that these two have been like very influential in bringing me there. And so, related to that, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, just to get started here, is your approach to reading and kind of intellectualism in general. Because one of the things that I never liked about leftism, as an outsider, is that they don't seem to be they kind of like, it's very orthodox. You have your set of books that are acceptable, your set of thinkers, and anything outside of that you can just dismiss as liberal or reactionary, and you just kind of put it to the side and you stick to what you know and what is on the good side. But it seems like you take a different approach than that, where you say you see value often in reading, all sorts of thinkers. So if we're talking about Nietzsche, this is a key point: is you think he is a reactionary, ultimately, but also he provides a lot of insight, and he's a thoughtful, interesting competitor for the left, and so you get value out of reading him.
Yeah,
Um,
this is a good point. I think it's an excellent point to begin the conversation around. And thanks for inviting me onto your show. And congratulations on launching this podcast. I love the premise of liberal talking to people on the left, because I used to be a liberal back many moons ago, and so it's interesting because when you talk about reading, I felt that reading was part of the reason that I became a Marxist. And I think that Marx and the tradition of Marxism necessitates this highly interdisciplinary or sort of robust and ambitious reading project. I think that is the case for a couple reasons. The first is I would say there has to be derived perhaps a psychological or maybe even a political spiritual account for commitment, right? That the idea of what it means to be committed to liberation, to emancipation, to some type of transformation of of a society, and you sort of enter into political consciousness at a young age, and you realize that all of the models that you were trained in the conventional institutions, even college, most of the time, and I mean, let's say 90% of the time, don't adequately address the root of the issue. And I think once we get to the tradition of Marxism, it's a sort of living and breathing tradition that exists beyond the university and that calls upon you to actually engage in study beyond just the study of political economy or the study of economics or the study of political theory and power, although those are the kind of primary. No, but Marx also was something like a literary critic. You have to develop a theory of ideology. In the early Marx, we have a theory of alienation. And really, for me, this is like a big reason why Freud becomes, in the 20th century, inextricable from the project of Marxism, which is we have to sort of disentangle the basis by which we are submitted to systems of power, systems of control. And I think that supplementary, let's call them supplementary philosophies, from existentialism to psychoanalysis to Nietzscheanism, to some extent Heidegger, although we can talk about that, become necessary interlocutors in understanding not only Marxism but like the project of human emancipation itself. And I think that as you read, one of the things that you should ask yourself, and I think you people do this no matter what, it's sort of an unconscious reflex. To what extent is this actually a practical guide for achieving something in my life? Everything has to be thought through what you might call a Socratic prism. In this question of like, Philosophy is a means for existence. It's a means for the discovery of of a higher purpose. And in that sense, um, I think once I discovered Marxism, I found myself on a path which I would characterize almost as like infinitely open. So, for example, I don't think that I'll ever fully feel that I have mastered the canon from which Marxism emerges. Another reason that is the case is because the canon from which Marxism emerges is, of course, the Enlightenment itself. So, Marx did his dissertation on Greek philosophy. There's, you know, a huge tradition of philosophical Marxism started really with thinkers like Korsch and with Lukács, who are extremely important to me, where they're basically trying to make the argument that philosophy is sort of a mandatory appendage to the Marxist vocation, to the Marxist practice. That's something that we can actually discuss because that becomes a huge polarizing debate internal to the Marxist movement itself. The role of philosophy becomes almost a scandal.
Mhm.
So it is that broad, ambitious, interdisciplinary thrust. I mean, but before I was a Marxist, when I was a kind of young, I mean, I started off politically as a liberal, but I really started off as somebody interested in literature, poetry, interested in history. I was very moved by like Harold Bloom. I was very moved by the power of the intellectual in an abstract sense
Mhm.
before I actually understood what an ideal intellectual ought to do. I didn't assign the ought, just sort of thought, oh, there's a social role, there's a sort of social type of an intellectual, and this was quite mesmerizing to me as a young person, right? So I started to be drawn to people who could articulate what they read in ways that were sort of made sense, that resonated. That's like a certain gift that I always wanted to master for myself. And one of the things I learned, I think, Dylan, is that it actually takes quite a lot of work to um, sort of convey difficult books of philosophy. Um, and I think that Marxism is sort of a home base in that regard for me. So, but again, just to sort of close, I think the notion of commitment is something that deeply interests me because I do think that that's also probably tied up with something like a something akin to, but not the same as spiritual or religious commitment, right?
Right.
Um, but now, as it pertains to the question you asked about reactionary thought, you're right that on the contemporary left, there has actually been the view that reactionary thought should be sort of circumscribed, should be avoided, should be canceled, all of this kind of thinking. And I think that in a certain way, those tendencies have also coincided with good old fashioned American anti intellectualism. And it's created almost like a toxic brew. Oftentimes, it's quite incoherent on the left in terms of the rationale as to why we shouldn't read so and so thinker. It's almost as if you give that thinker more power than
Yeah.
perhaps they possess unto themselves because you have mystified them as, I don't know, mysteriously possessing some power to distort people's. I think one of the things that people worry about, of course, is that I think that the kind of libidinal constitution of some people, politically speaking, can be towards the extreme or it can actually express a kind of intensity. And I think that there has been examples of people that have shifted from the right to the left and, in fairly dramatic ways. That's a real empirical thing. We could point to examples of that happening. So I think perhaps it's somewhat like we can somewhat understand the fear that people have and being exposed to radical thought that you would fall sway to the right. But I also think, and this is sort of one of the ways that I would analyze this phenomenon, I think that on the American left, there is a middle class problem. And what I mean by that is that there becomes a sort of exoticization of the working class subject as a figure who is reactionary almost ontologically, just by like their mere existence.
Mhm.
And this leads to this notion that really right-wing thought or people on the right um, are kind of like demonic, or they are sort of not eligible for change. Like we actually don't, we're not in the business to try to convert them to our program. And that's one thing that I feel, and I'm not claiming that I succeed in this, but that's one thing I feel that the left really needs to revisit, which is this kind of abandonment of kind of a model of rational deliberation in which I am sharing my commitments with you, which, as I've just articulated, are kind of emanating from a site of almost like a kind of spiritual commitment in a certain way. We can talk about secularism and atheism and Christianity, but you see my point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have no shame in trying to convert people, as it were, to the left. And I think that perhaps there was a time when the left was more comfortable and at ease with this idea of converting people to its cause. But what I see is a kind of middle class reflexive view of the left, oftentimes where basically the idea of the left is sort of this pristine and pure entity, which doesn't require us to be critical of it as a construct. And we end up basically otherizing people on the right in ways where we just absolutely bar them from any participation in the project of the left. So if you come to the left with questions, with skepticism, with criticism about what you've experienced with other leftists, let's say, it's often, and I don't know if you see this yourself, it can often be quite difficult because it kind of functions on an in-group, out-group sort of logic. And I think that those logics then get transplanted to how we on the left think about engaging reactionary thinkers. But at the same time, and now I'll really close, there's also a lot of contradictions with that, as I document in my book on Nietzsche, because the way that Nietzsche in particular is dealt with by leftists is they disavow the fact of his reactionary position. And my claim is that this is actually not only like dishonest, but that it sort of misses the richness that Nietzsche could offer to the left. So it's a misreading that is less productive than a more honest appraisal could be. That's a complex point. I can parse that out if you wish, but that's what I would say to the question of reading and engaging reactionaries.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a few different ways I could go with that, and like the order of these questions is kind of a difficult question. But I guess for now, I'll just say that's one of the things I appreciate about Cutrone is that I do think he claims to, and at times does, in an interesting kind of contradictory way, demystify things, and so he will confront certain subjects more plainly and bluntly than the left will, and so he'll approach them from a different side, and so that makes it easier to listen to him and kind of get. I think he kind of holds on to kind of an older kernel of Marxism, and you can kind of understand better what actually Marx was saying or what Lenin was saying than you would have if you just kind of generally listened to the left, because I think the left kind of generally inherits so many different ideas, and they're not always good at like disentangling them. But with that said, obviously Cutrone has, when it comes to contemporary politics, he goes in directions that I find confusing, and I can kind of understand his ideas. But I do want to get into those actual ideas, because I think in your conversation with him, it was interesting. I appreciated it. But I feel like there was some core ideas that I'm not sure you two really like untangled or discussed as much as you should have. So one of those I want to talk about. I've frequently mentioned that Bonapartism is like the most interesting idea in Marxism to me. It's like the most persuasive and just fascinating idea. And so when you both spoke about that, I mean, he did say it that for him, there's something about the presidency in the U.S. that is more democratic. And, as a Marxist who's inheriting the Enlightenment tradition, he cares about democracy in some way. And so in some way, he has to maintain, with criticism, the democratic presidency against the Bonapartist, like capitalist state of the U.S., right? So I wanted to know what you think about that. What do you think about him kind of separating those pieces of like the Bonapartist state at large versus the presidency and sort of the democratic aspect of that? And how much do we really care about democracy in a capitalist system. I mean, yeah, what do you think about what he's raising there?
It's a big debate within Bonapartist studies on the left, and obviously there's liberal and there's Marxist and even other variations and theories of Bonapartism. Marxism is not the only one. Oftentimes, people will pit, as you did, this kind of dichotomy or antinomy between forms of democratic political leadership and forms of Bonapartist leadership as sort of a strong distinction. On the one hand. On the other hand, there are Marxists who seem to suggest that almost every democratic political force is itself kind of infected with or permeates a form of Bonapartism. And this was expressed through, this distinction that some Marxists develop, including Gramsci, between the soft and the hard Bonapartist. So that's a helpful distinction for me to understand, because you see, one of the reasons that Bonapartism became, I think, important for a Marxist tradition is because it allows a point of distinction to emerge between a future socialist form of leadership that would be other than Bonapartist, you know? And so, on the one hand, and it also helps us to sort of create a taxonomy of the intensity of reaction or repression of sort of tyrannous state control or dictatorship potential of the Bonapartist leader across the spectrum, right? What I theorize Bonapartism to be about, actually, is something slightly different. So first off, I agree that actually the concept is best understood as an aberration from the norm, from the normal arrangement of bourgeois politics. And that actually Bonapartism is a response to sort of a deep crisis, both of the middle class, of, let's say, the general bourgeoisie as such, in their capacity to represent their values, in their capacity. So it's ultimately a question of the coherence of their project and their legitimacy. So when their legitimacy and their values go into a sort of free fall or a crisis, and this can be spawned by any number of factors, from war to imperialism to a systemic crisis of the market, like the great crash of 2008, for example. You will then, with some degree of predictability, because that's the other function of the Bonapartist theory, is to give us a predictability of political rule in capitalist society. You will, but with some degree of predictability, get a Bonapartist leader that will emerge to sort of pacify that crisis and ultimately to sort of redirect, but retain the material relations of the status quo while they're doing that. And I think that Trumpism is a perfect example of that. And in a way, the Bonapartist, almost like when you're playing football and you get winded, when you get knocked down. I've never had that experience before. That's kind of how it feels, in the sense that you weren't expecting it, and it's kind of like a shock to your body, but everything goes on. Nothing truly changes. And so in that sense, the Bonapartist is sort of like the solution of the continuity of the bourgeoisie as a class. And I think that's one of the things that I love about the theory, which is that it helps us to create a kind of historical genealogy of the evolution, if you will, of forms of class rule. And in that regard, we can sort of identify aberrations, Bonapartist aberrations that emerge at certain moments in history, right? Some subsequent Marxists, in the Althusserian school, have argued that, and many people have actually been quite persuaded by this, such as the Greek Marxist French thinker Nikos Palancis in his theories of the state. He really thinks that Bonapartism is no longer a feasible kind of conceptual operator, largely, I think, having to do with the fact that the system no longer contains a viable Workers' Party or Socialist Party element internal to the parliamentary system. So the parliamentary system, at the dawn of neoliberalism, reverts to a type of terminal liberalism in its representational capacity. Again, the theory of Bonapartism was to help us, A, come up with the idea of how the bourgeoisie saves itself in the face of crisis of its legitimacy, but B, provide a point of contrast to two other things: fascism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. So fascism is a kind of aberration of the aberration, if that phrase makes sense. In other words, it's Bonapartism on steroids. It's Bonapartism which consciously and tacitly moves beyond the democratic machinery of the state and renounces the democratic machinery of the state and assumes a full position of kind of like executive rule, which would have, in the case of the American context, no cooperation with Congress, which I think the democratic norms of the American system would, I think, be so fundamentally, structurally preventative of such a scenario ever happening, even though we have an oversized power of the executive branch. And that has been something that's been happening since Nixon. That's obvious. But still, even though we have an oversized power of the executive, that doesn't take away from some of the fundamental mechanisms that keep the system and the presidency in check. So this is like a fundamental liberal democratic set of mechanisms that will, I think, with some degree of certainty, prevent a Bonapartist aberration from going full fascist. I mean, my view on the fascism debate is that I think it's valid for us to invoke something like post-fascism. I think it's less valid or less persuasive to actually call Trumpism, the new right, akin to 20th century fascism, because we then fall into a kind of ahistorical position. So that's just a side point. But the reason that I like Bonapartism is because it helps us develop a theory of reaction internal to the parliamentary democratic system that also helps us sort of contrast that to something more. Well, what I really like about it, and incidentally, what Nietzsche really liked about it as well, because Nietzsche has his own theory of Bonapartism, by the way, very different than Marx's, okay? Because Nietzsche admired Napoleon very, very much. And one of the things that he really admired about Napoleon is the way that, and this is something the Bonapartist leader also does, uh, Napoleon and then subsequent Bonapartist figures later are always characterized by their capacity to entrance the masses. The entrancement of the masses, kind of turning the masses away from their self-interest, rerouting their interest back into the interest of the bourgeois state, is another instrument that the Bonapartist leader does. And Napoleon did this in a curious way. If you know anything about his expansion, what did Napoleon do when he went to Egypt, for example? He converted to Islam. You know, he said that civil society is more powerful than the sword. So another reason why Bonapartists is so ingenious, they know they have some capacity to fragment the working class movement. This is the reason why Marxists are so concerned about Bonapartism. And I think as it pertains to Cutrone, my one criticism of him on this in this matter would be that perhaps he sometimes possesses a fatalistic view on Bonapartism, right? Or he may possess a too optimistic view that a Bonapartist figure could be trusted or is to be, it becomes unclear, almost like one wonders when listening to Chris talk about Bonapartism, whether he thinks that socialism, and I don't know what he would say to this, necessitates its own Bonapartist. Probably he would push back on that, but keep in mind this. I don't know if you're aware of Marx's debates with Ferdinand Lassalle,
Yeah.
a kind of very charismatic socialist figurehead who himself was content to abandon a kind of rational class independence form of political organization and, in essence, put forward this sort of idea that what the workers really need is for the charismatic leader, i.e. himself, right? To sort of stand in for their interests. And it led to all kinds of betrayals and reformist tendencies, and ultimately a very poor conception of class. This is one of the reasons that Marx didn't fully reject Lassalle. I mean, sometimes he did, but he often kept Lassalle very close because while Lassalle was off on his own idiosyncratic views on these matters, he also called himself a Marxist, right? And so he too, like most Marxists, aspired to earn the mantle of being a Marxist,
Right.
but was never quite capable of achieving it in a certain way. Um, Keep in mind also that Gramsci used to wield the Bonapartist label to fellow socialists, similar to platypus society today, you could say, and they probably will criticize me for saying this, who exhibit a type of a sort of adventurism or a sort of position in which, uh, yeah, we can kind of waver from the party, we can waver from the working class movement. Now, the reality is, of course, is that we are constrained by the fact that we have no constraints today, meaning that socialist intellectuals are beholden really to themselves and to ethical principles that they reinforce with one another because we have the absence of a party.
Right.
But like, you know, in Italy, in Germany, even in the United States, we have long traditions in the 20th century of socialist parties in which these questions of leadership were taken quite seriously. And so Bonapartism was almost like a sign that one was um, acting too individualistically. It was a sign of opportunism. Sign of opportunism would could get one brandished a Bonapartist, right? If you're too eager to sort of partner with bourgeois parties, right? That represents a threat eventually that you will sell out the working class movement, right? So there's a lot to say about Bonapartism. I too, like you, very much appreciate the theory, um, and I find it fascinating, frankly. There's so much to be said, though.
Right. I mean, I actually want to push back a little bit on what a couple things, but so first of all, what I think is interesting is that I think what you just said about Chris in terms of LaSalle and you know all of that. I think that's the exact thing he would say about you, in a funny way, because I've actually read what he's written about LaSalle and other, and he basically identifies a statist tradition of Marxism, which is essentially inferior to what Marx wrote, and he identifies it with LaSalle, and he says this strain is essentially making a concession to the Bonapartist state, and it's basically just creating like a sort of, we would call it state capitalism. And he actually identifies that tradition very strongly, and that's one of his main enemies, I would say. And so, in a way, when he's like skeptical of you, I think, and skeptical of your project, and calls you a Stalinist or whatever, I think he's actually making that exact same critique. He's saying that you're the opportunist, you're the statist, Bonapartist. Now who's right about that? I don't know, but I just think it's worth noting that simply that he would definitely not like claim to take that position. He makes it very clear.
Well, I think it's slightly difficult to answer this in part because the accusation of me as a Stalinist or my accusation of him as what is my accusation against him on this whole point? I suppose it would be that we often hear him rhetorically refer to the kind of Trumpian moment as almost like a kind of a force of history,
Yeah.
which itself is a legitimate expression of like the proletariat or of a kind of like. In other words, I fear that Chris ends up reifying a conception of Trumpism as a sort of almost like Hegelian world spirit
Mm-hmm.
that actually is that has a rational kernel to it. I think he really thinks that Trump has a rational kernel,
Yeah.
almost again in a kind of pseudo Hegelian way. The danger with that is, of course, that Trump most likely is not a historical figure in this manner. And oftentimes the point of analysis that we hear on sublation in the Cutrone zone refers to Trump uh, with almost like a calculated, a rational point of view and a kind of genius. There's an admission that something going on with Trump actually has a sort of the quality of a Bonapartist you see historically in Marxism
Mm-hmm.
was like a third point from the two dominant bourgeois parties. They typically come from outside of the two dominant bourgeois parties. It's exactly where Donald Trump comes from.
Yeah.
And so my feeling is that on the one hand, Trump is not to be understood in this like capacity where he possesses. I think actually Trump is way more constrained than Chris often portrays him to be. On the one hand, on the other hand, I think that Trump does not have some mastermind, sort of rationally thought out scheme
Mm-hmm.
of rule. I think that Trump is riddled with narcissism, riddled with opportunism, and riddled with incoherence. Okay. So I think we would disagree on that point. I think the idea that Trump, for example, with the Doge Acts, right, with the curtailing of the bureaucrats in the U.S. government from January to just like last month in May, which constituted hundreds of thousands of firings and so on. I would struggle to identify a higher logic by which this act was done other than a kind of blind resentment or a blind, almost like in classical Roman times,
Mm-hmm.
like giving a little bit of scraps to the masses to satiate them,
Yeah.
purely on a symbolic level. So you see, I almost would feel that that actually is more in line with Bonapartist logics themselves. Bonapartism is always, in most cases, a reflection of the decadent social order embodied through a single leader figure. But that doesn't presuppose that that single leader figure is capable of penetrating beyond that decadence themselves. No, they have a particular capacity to channel the discontents of the capitalist world system for their own individual achievement, but by no means are they then able to revolutionize the system itself. It always ends in uh, uh, buffoonery. It always ends in a kind of charade. That's the end point of the Bonapartist experience, right? And in that sense, every lesson that a socialist could get from a Bonapartist leader, a socialist leader would have to take it in the opposite direction. And I fear that Chris often um, sees sort of a movement like Trumpism as sort of instructive. It's always sort of like this is actually giving us lessons, right? And there becomes almost like a seduction of the power that's on display there. But I question whether that power is actually a simulacrum at the end of the day. I question the integrity of that power at the end of the day. And I think that, look at the Iran situation right now.
Yeah.
This is a total effacement to the original vision of Donald Trump, which was founded, his popularity was founded off of doing the exact opposite of what he's doing now. So does that represent this kind of rational kernel? No. No, that represents that Trump is beholden like a puppet to bourgeois class interest for which he cannot transcend. So I'm skeptical. I think that Trump has the qualities of Bonapartism, but I think what Chris often theorizes him as something more than that, as Caesarist, because that's, again, a very important distinction that Marx abandons this distinction, but Engels in his later years retains it, which is this idea that the Bonapartists can transform themselves into a Caesarist figure. And a Caesarist figure is basically defined as a figure who assumes like the pure mantle of executive power, and they then transcend being beholden to the
Right.
petty machinations of the bourgeois class or the capitalist class. In other words, they act as a historical actor. They're not beholden to, say, the capitalist class or the financial aristocracy. They work beyond that.
Yeah.
I don't think that Trump works beyond the financial aristocracy, for example. I think he's very much beholden to Wall Street. Where he's a genius is showing to the public that he appears different than he really is. So it's a game of deception with him, and I think that Chris often takes him quite seriously, maybe too seriously than he should be taken.
Yeah, I actually wanted to say, um, I mean, I completely agree with your characterization of the what he's doing with Trump, that he's kind of like a force of history, and ascribing way too much more genius. I mean, he admits that he's not a genius, but then he will kind of ascribe him that power at the same time. But kind of the point I was making, and I actually made this point to him, was I think that Chris theoretically actually goes in a different direction than how he applies it to Trump. That's kind of what I'm trying to present here. So I think that his theory of Bonapartism is actually a lot more sound than maybe you realize, or I'm not sure. And that's what I found very interesting. But I think the way that he applies it to Trump is the part that I'm confused about. And I actually made the same point to him. I said, I completely understand how you see Bonapartism. It makes sense. But I don't understand how you apply it to Trump. Because it seems to me that Trump is just sort of a manifestation of the Bonapartist system in kind of an extreme, frustrating way. And that's kind of exactly what he is. And he didn't fully disagree with me. He said that's true, but then also he went on to kind of do what you were describing with the Hegelian. Has this force of history and all that. But my point was to say that the conception of Bonapartism that I get, and I think this is separate from what he says about Trump, from him and also like Spencer Leonard, I suppose, is that Bonapartism is really kind of the final form of the capitalist state, and so when you read the 18th Brumaire, everyone's really Bonapartist, right? The left wing parties are kind of impotent, and they're subsumed into the parliamentary system, and they're just kind of just there. The right wing is contradictory, they're also subsumed by like moneyed interests, and then at the same time they have this kind of royalist vision, but these are in contradiction, and they're never going to resolve it. And Bonaparte, Louis Napoleon III, he's also kind of just contradictory. He will just pander to everyone. I mean, really what they present when they teach Bonapartism, and this is what I find fascinating, is that all of these pieces are necessary to understand Bonapartism. All of them. They're all Bonapartists. They're all indicating kind of the ultimate point of the Bonapartist state. And they make the point that it's not just about France. Bismarck is a Bonapartist figure. Even both the liberals and the conservatives in England at this time are also Bonapartist.
Right.
Because ultimately the example they cite, and they really strongly connect this to imperialism, where they say the important part about imperialism is not the colonialism. It's actually the state itself showing its worst excesses in those other places. So if you ask Spencer Leonard, he'll say India, like exploiting India wasn't only about exploiting India. It was also about demonstrating the harshness and the hypocrisy and the contradictory nature of liberalism, right? That once you left London, your rights don't really mean anything anymore, and the excesses of the Bonapartist imperialist state dictate that they're going to do things that are absolutely not liberal. They're absolutely contradictory, right? And so they'll use the example of there's an article that Marx wrote about the Second Opium War, I think it is, whatever, and Marx basically refers to the idea that both the liberals and the conservatives were kind of captured by Lord Palmerston, who I believe was like the Tory conservative, and he made a speech about the name of the English crown, and like they were being desecrated, and ultimately the people wanted their tea to be cheaper, and so it was very easy to sort of harness the false the inner desires of the masses in the same way that happened in France, or typical of the Bonapartist concept. Right. And they also used the nationalism and sort of the contradictions of liberalism, and just sort of threw all of that out, because you'd think as a liberal that even at that time a true philosophical liberal as I am would say, okay, we can't just like violate international law and treaties. Like we have to actually like care about these things. I mean, they didn't have as full of a conception of international law, but it did exist. And so kind of the point of the theory, it seems to me, for Cutrone and Spencer Leonard in this case, to say this shows, whether we're talking about England, and Marx talks about this directly, whether we're talking about England or France, all of these are really showing the dark side, the true contradiction of the capitalist state. That's kind of the point of the theory. And I find that to be very persuasive, and that seems to be very in line with Marxists. But that also seems, my point is that theory seems in contradiction to the way he applies it to Trump. But I don't think that takes away from the theory itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I generally agree with that point. Especially, I enjoy this reminder that imperialism is the exportation of Bonapartism, if done successfully, as a mechanism of the pacification, ultimately, of the unruly proletarian element within any capitalist social order in a certain way. And the Bonapartist, you can see immediately why the socialist would care about the problem of Bonapartism, because they have effaced or they have undone the type of coalition and solidarity that we are after. They've kind of, and this I think is what is true, that Trump has done some operation on the working class in America that's comparable to that, without question. But I'm not sure that we should understand Trump's relationship to those interests in any way that is sort of mediatory. I think in a way, really what that is a sign of is the absence of a countervailing left force, largely due to the hegemony of the centrist Democratic Party, that would actually be able to get into the arena, because there's no leftist argument to the working class about going in a different way from Trumpism. That takes us back to the left's avoidance of class, cancel culture, segregation. I would say cultural, educational segregation of the class system, expressed through not only the Democrats, but I would say like a much wider NGO civil society apparatus, which has kind of successfully demonized the working class as some type of other, and therefore barred them from their project, right? It's very difficult to sort of meet the criteria to be part of the Democrat club in a certain way. So I just, again, I can see a sort of logic of like a force of history of Trump dividing the class system, and that I can see this aligning with the general historical trend of Bonapartism. And I think that's valuable. Where I don't see much purpose is in taking our analysis much further than that. Because on the one hand, it's never been a sustainable coalition. Just look at the internal fractures of the Trump coalition.
Right.
He's never, with the exception of these last few months, he's never really had a figure who could actually function to implement Trump's policies in a way that is rigorous and enforced. He's always floundered in that regard. So practically, programmatically, what is Trumpism? Really, Trumpism is a rhetorical flourish. It's a kind of brand. It's a sort of affective outrage campaign.
Right.
It's a resentment politics. And that's actually very interesting because of Nietzsche's view on Bonapartism and ressentiment, right? There's actually several books written on Nietzsche and Bonapartism. I recently gave a lecture on this. It's a very interesting point of contrast, I think, to the Marxist view in a certain way. Of course, because Nietzsche's view on Bonapartism is extremely positive. And who's his example of Bonapartist that he finds most compelling is, of course, Bismarck. Bismarck is a Bonapartist figure that Nietzsche embraces and kind of holds his nose and becomes a kind of compromised, what you might call reactionary liberal, because Bismarck was able to achieve something that Nietzsche ultimately desires, which is the pacification of the masses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? So that's one thing the Bonapartists can achieve. They can achieve the pseudo-pacification of the class struggle. That's the other problem here, and this is why liberals also make a compact. This is an important point that I think should challenge any liberal, which is when push comes to shove, the Bonapartist emergence on the historical scene inevitably will force the liberal coalition to cooperate with them.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes a necessity. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's a set of material class interests that both the Bonapartist figure and the liberal coalition are serving. But otherwise, without the Bonapartist, that wouldn't be revealed. So in a certain way, perhaps, as a force of history, Bonapartist figure does reveal something.
Mm-hmm.
But the content of that is not by any means rational content that we can ever seek to imitate. And again, I'm not accusing Chris of trying to create a socialist Bonapartism. Although, I mean, there are although maybe there are definitely people on the left, let's put it that way, who would conceive of communism. I mean, keep in mind also the Bolsheviks had a theory of transition from their early revolution to 1917, where they theorized Bonapartism as a necessary stage of the revolution itself,
Mhm.
thinking in the kind of historical repetition of the French Revolution itself, right? So that's not beyond the pale, right? Um, but again, it really requires us to think sort of, well, what actually is the socialist theory of political leadership? And again, this is why it's such a rich concept.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to talk a little bit more since you mentioned about the liberal perspective of it, and I want to talk about a little bit about how I see things, and um, yeah, just I'll take on that critique. So, I mean, as you mentioned, there is something that is revealed about liberals and like the left wing of the, the relative left wing of the Bonapartist politics is that there's the material interests, but I also think analytically, I think we have to acknowledge something more. I think when we look at the way the Democrats, for example, are behaving right now, it's not simple material interests. I just don't. This is something I don't like about leftism or Marxism is too much focus on material interests. I think it's valuable, and realistically, it's not a complete and total obsession um, with necessarily. But I think it is a bad temptation because I think if you really analyze what they're doing, there's also a sense in which they've committed themselves to this system, this political system, and they don't have values past that, right? So it's all about the present political necessity, and because they've lost any principles that their forebears would have had, they just sort of operate on that, right? So I think when Chuck Schumer decides he's going to pass a bill, I don't think it's really material interests. I think ultimately what it is he's spent his entire life being a politician, right? And being a politician means passing things that people will like you for, creating coalitions, trying to run an analysis of when are people going to vote for you, and you completely sacrifice all values. And so all liberal principles and values that I would say that I cherish, when it comes to rule of law and democracy, those go out the window because we don't need to have a deep conception of them. So I really appreciate the Bonapartist theory for shining a true light on kind of the impotence of the parliamentary process or politicians or whatever. But I think we have to acknowledge something more than just material conditions and material interest, because yeah, again, I mean, I as a liberal can make the case, I think, for liberal values, and I can also say that Democrats don't uphold those. But it doesn't seem to me that Democrats don't uphold them because they're right wing or because they're materially compromised. And I mean, they are in some extent. To some extent, I just don't think that's defining. I just think.
Yeah, you are. I think this is. I just want to introduce a concept to frame the conversation about what the meaning of a material interest actually is. So first off, it would be the notion of capitalist realism. Are you familiar with this idea? It's
Mm,
from the late kind of British philosopher named Mark Fisher. It's a pretty helpful way of thinking because when I hear you talk about this particular point, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Because leftism in its historical expression was actually about a revolutionary vision. And as such, uh, there was the possibility of construing political engagement, not as inevitably caught within a system which is unchangeable or the possibility of its revolutionary possibility is thrown out the window. That's capitalist realism. I feel that you're presupposing that horizon almost like as the phenomenological uh, world in which we cannot escape. Whereas historically, the left was always about a revolutionary agitation, about overcoming of the system as a precondition of the engagement of us as political actors to begin with. In other words, um, Chuck Schumer is probably not always going to be voting based on a vulgar conception of like his stock portfolio. That's not my claim. I do think that there may be some brute pragmatist or empiricist leftism in the American context that would construe it that way. We see this a lot. Like I've seen this application that you can get on your phone, which allows you to, in real time, mimic your stock investments to Nancy Pelosi's. And then you can see how Pelosi's stock investments mirror her decisions to some extent. But that's not what I would actually define as a point of interest. What I would define as a point of interest would be systemically construed. What I'm talking about as a point of interest would be about a more total conception of a vision of society itself and acting in accordance to it. And therefore, the difference between liberal and socialist at this level would be a difference regarding a vision of political worldview such that true change is possible versus, frankly, what liberalism, according to Marxism, would be reducible to, would be a reaction against that. So ultimately, when push comes to shove, the problem is that we haven't really been exposed to socialist versus liberal politics that would truly reveal that schism, because the centrist liberals have effectively barred socialists from truly expressing socialist ideals within the parliamentary system. Now, what that means is that most expressions of socialism are outside of the parliamentary system, right? And this is, I think, part of the reason why you get either the academic siloization of socialism, where it's like almost like so radical that it's apolitical, or you get socialist expression, because I would argue that along with a huge segment of the working class, a massive portion of socialists are actually for the abstention from bourgeois elections. This was most evident in the most recent election. Vast majority of my friends abstained from the last election. One, because of the genocide in Gaza, purely on a principled standpoint, but two, because we knew that Biden and the whole Biden phenomenon had its locus, its nucleus, in a reaction to the Sanders phenomenon. And the Sanders phenomenon was a very, very mild social democracy thing. Its appearance as something more than that is a total distortion from reality. So the reality by which we're talking about material interests, I think, is working within a prism of capitalist realism, in which we don't really have available this notion that actors, political actors, can actually be operating from the position of, when I say maintaining status quo, that only means something when there are other actors who are threatening the status quo. And I think the Democrats have been very adept at basically neutering any would-be leftist from holding a view that would be in a critical relationship to capitalism as such. I mean, it used to be the case that in the Second International period, you know, from like the late 1890s to World War I, socialists had the view that revolution was a very possible phenomenon. And it was like something that was within our reach as agents. That, in fact, when we speak as socialists, we don't speak with a shame about the desire for revolution. No, that's our desire. That's what's driving the whole thing. I think the problem now is that we're so far from that position, but we shouldn't be. We absolutely should not be. And I would like to reintroduce that kind of conception into politics beyond a kind of a fatalistic sort of capitalist realism. Because on the other hand, my theory of material interest, and like I'm more into psychoanalysis than behaviorism. So like my psychological analysis of human interest is not like this pinball world in which people like act to get rich, or no, like I know that human desire is not sort of realized in some neat or homogeneous transitive way to a direct object. No, human desire is actually founded in lack, and it itself is founded in a convoluted relationship to itself. The human subject is also deluded to their own desires. So, but as a class, the Democrats do function in concert with not so much their own personal material interests, but with the material interests that sustain their class. And that is what I think Marxists care about. It's the linkage to the class material interests, which again is not like a hedonistic interest or like I desire to have a mansion. That may be one effect, but that's actually what's more elemental is the preservation of class interests. So I don't know. That's kind of a long-winded response, but I felt like it's important to clarify that that's not where I'm coming from on that point.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I understand. I mean, I do understand where you're coming from in some sense, but I just struggle a lot with. It feels like it's very hard to just get like people to honestly talk about the state of things, you know. So, um, is it the case that you can identify sort of a broader like class interest and a status quo, you know, kind of basis of the Democrats? Absolutely. But at the same time, I mean, again, if you take my position in good faith, right? If you say that I'm honestly just a liberal, and I've figured that the way we can have the most human flourishing is some form of liberal democracy, I think so far, and I just want, uh, I want that to be explored. It seems to me that like Democrats are a lot more of like a tragic, figure where they just don't understand these things. They just don't understand like really what they ought to, and to the extent that they do, they're struggling for a whole host of reasons. And I'm not convinced that leftism really like gives us an answer, right? Because practically, I'm not, I'm not opposed to a better society or a better world that is not, like but I haven't been convinced so far that yeah, I guess let's just start there. That's something practical we can hold on to there. How can we have a grounding to say this is what's wrong, this is why it's wrong, very practically, very empirically, and then how do we build something greater than that? Because um, yeah, I don't know. That we can start there.
Well, I would say to a Democrat that there has that in fact I think that the tragic position is very apt, very accurate in some sense to describe um, the liberal worldview. And this is actually a motif. Speaking of like this early question you asked me about reading and why Marxism requires reading is also because of history. And this notion actually is developed by a great Marxist thinker named Lucien Goldman, where he argued that the bourgeoisie in its original form, before it had its revolution in France, was really formed in what he calls a tragic worldview, in which the possibility of social revolution was the constitutive basis of its founding. In other words, it was founded on a reaction against the possibility of a change in society. And this is actually why, like, instead of dialectics, they embrace like paradox, right? And so this idea, ultimately, what sort of the revolving current of liberalism becomes is the reaffirmation of the existing state of things. In other words, the liberal kind of is a shepherd of the status quo, right? And they therefore become an apologist of the status quo. So I think one of the most important things that I would want to explain to a liberal is that we've seen a very interesting set of changes in our life over the past 20, 30 years, in which rhetorically, we talked before about how Trumpism may, at the end of the day, be like a brand or like a rhetorical flourish. It's very successful at mesmerizing the masses. Well, you have to ask yourself, why has liberalism not been able to do that? It used to. That's what Obama was. Obama himself actually proved to be a mesmerizer and a brand of liberalism. But materially, there's that word again, what was he able to achieve it? Was he able to go the final sense? Was he able to leave the effect in the masses, to leave the effect of, in fact, we've delivered something, we've eased something? No, actually, the end of Obama was you've made something worse. You somehow made something worse. So it's that rhetorical idealism that liberalism has, and we can chart historically when, how long this has been going on, has been succumbed to. I'll give you a little example. Why do you think Beto O'Rourke, for example, as a great, liberal politician, very charismatic, he's very handsome, he's young, he's very dynamic. Why was he so unpopular? He was unpopular because the people had already abandoned the rhetorical idealism of liberalism. It didn't affect them at all, right? So this again goes back to, I think, a material substratum. And of course, I'm not denying the importance of rhetoric and speech and the kind of power that can galvanize in political coalition. Of course, it's essential. But you see, I think ultimately, I think what liberalism needs to confront is this deadlock. Is this fundamental deadlock? And we need to ask, what is a true analysis of that deadlock? Are we to understand that deadlock in a kind of quasi-idealist spiritual register, in which, in a kind of non-systemic register? I mean, one of the things that interests me about the abundance thinkers, Ezra Klein and others, is that they sort of, for the first time, are trying to think almost like systemically, as liberals. But you notice that they're only willing to go so far in thinking systemically. There's still like a lot of things that they won't do, and everything that they would want to change has like this whole like control paradigm as bound up with it. And I think you'd have to ask yourself, what are the mechanisms that are constraining your ambition to actually change the system of power and the basis of the distribution of resources? I will agree with you that Marxists tend to have a very clear answer, right? And almost you could criticize Marxists perhaps as having an answer to that question, which is too immediate. And what is the answer? Well, we take over the we control the mode of production, and we overthrow the capitalist class. We have like a whole procedure by which revolution is to take place in an ideal sense. Of course, the historical record of revolutions and socialist revolutions is very mixed. There's actually many, many positive examples of socialist revolutions which did not devolve into reigns of terror or profound pogroms or violence. We could talk about those. But I think that question of liberalism is so interesting in our era, in which liberalism doesn't have a truly great rival. Because ultimately, the Bonapartist right-wing rival, how much of a real rival is it to liberalism?
Yeah.
If we're analyzing the material interests, as we've said before, the Trumpist thing ultimately has an immediate solidarity with them at that level, right? So those are my questions. Those are some questions I would pose to liberals today. Perhaps it is a question of your real, of asking who your constituents are. Liberals are always interested in like, who's your constituents, right? Who's your clients, right? Of course, Marxists don't really think of the proletariat and the working class as constituents. That's kind of a passive-aggressive conception. But I think maybe liberals would be better served if they more seriously confronted who their constituents really are. Oftentimes it's not clear to me.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, I don't know. I have a hard time with this because I feel like there's a very real liberal tradition that I believe in, and I feel like there's empirical reasons to believe in it. But at the same time, I mean, I'm really not convinced by any of these like Democrat politicians you can mention. I mean, these are all like very far off of. These are like at best they're okay, like but they don't really mean anything. They don't really believe in anything. And you could say that the fact that they don't really believe in anything is a sign of something that I should look into more seriously, maybe. Um, but I guess, I mean, there's two different ways we could go with this. I mean, we could talk more about, some practical examples of like other revolutions that you mentioned. But I also feel like there's sort of like fundamental philosophical problems that, if you really follow this train of thinking, you get to like philosophical bedrock, um, which is that for me, when I look at the world, I guess I have a very, simply, I have a very like vulgar kind of skepticism and cynicism where I just don't think that there's much that we can really uh, imagine that is real. I think we often fall to very simple impulses and patterns of behavior. And so I think when you look at the realm of politics, there's a lot of aspirations that all end up reinforcing the same patterns. So I'm very skeptical towards populism, for example, because it seems to me that if you look historically, every time that some guy said I'm going to fight for the people, it just went horribly. It
Yeah.
just goes horribly every time. And
Right.
so, and then I look at like if I look at the Roman Empire, for example, to me, if I'm looking at the Roman Empire honestly, it's all just failing because of problems that liberalism empirically like addresses in a very logical sense. So I can say
Right.
that liberalism addresses the Roman Empire because it removes slavery. It has a popular will behind it, and it also has a system of rules that prevent emperors from just doing crazy things. People like to say that there were like good Roman emperors that were like really wonderful, but the reality is that every Roman emperor stretched their power to the point that was degrading of the institution. That's just the reality. It
Mm-hmm.
was all just it was consistently a mess, and so that's why I like liberalism, is because in a very practical, observable sense, it just seems to be better for society when you have a stability in your political system, and so. Because that is kind of my philosophical bedrock, I'm not really convinced by a Hegelian sense of history yet, unfortunately. And so because that is my bedrock is very skeptical, I just don't see a reason to start moving to something unless I know that it's going to help people. I have to know
Understood.
that.
Understood. Well, one question I have is, um, are you recording?
Yeah.
It is recording.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Because on my end, it's not clear if it is. Sorry. So, look, I think stability is there's something great and noble about the desire for stability. One of the reasons why I'm a socialist is because of my experience growing up. And there's a kind of lie or a kind of myth uh, about poverty and what it does to people, that I think that if you ever anecdotally come into sort of contact with it, it sort of changes you. It sort of really, even again, like, class in America is a very interesting phenomenon. It's very heterogeneous. It's not like in Europe. Like historically in Europe, you have like whole families that like have working class, like going back generations they can't remember, right? There's never been class mobility.
Right.
In the United States, there's a huge variance of class mobility, and you have families that sort of rise up and rise down the class ladder. And that, in some sense, makes the class experience in America much more intense. Because if you are a figure or a sort of individual who has a portion of your family who really struggles in this life, in this world, um, it changes you, because that affects their whole being. That affects their capacity to have a flourishing life. That affects their stability. Stability becomes relative, right? We ask ourselves, when you see sort of this class phenomenon and the kind of suffering that it engenders, it's not an easy thing to metabolize for yourself. And I think that it often it gets expressed in different ways, probably through either like self-help, kind of therapeutic culture. There's actually a lot written about the way that therapeutic culture depoliticizes people.
Right.
I've actually tried to write a lot of essays about how we might use therapy for repoliticizing people and building a class consciousness. But what I'm trying to say is that I have a different view than you do, perhaps because I've seen ways of life that are anything but stable. So this whole notion of stability itself reeks of a type of elitism. And I think that liberalism itself has, and this goes to its the historical basis of liberalism and perhaps some kind of idealist frameworks or constructs of what liberalism really is, it has always been a steward of the status quo, even decadent and internally fractious and fragmentary and degraded status quos. So there's a lot that liberalism refuses to see regarding the social system itself. And I felt that Marxism, because it makes such a decisive position in the class movement of history, it resonated with me for that reason. But again, initially from that empirical experience of actually witnessing the deterioration of modes of life of my loved ones and family, and how that often takes on like a geographic quality. And it's kind of usually on the margins of cities these days. It's usually quite hidden. There's actually quite a lot of shame about that. So that's one of the frustrating things about working class politics today, which is the status of the working class is not what it used to be when capitalism was primarily industrial based. Finance capitalism has really harmed the overall strength of the working class. And so that remains like a strategic problem for us as socialists. How do you organize that mass, which is dealing with very particular issues, right? It's not all doom and gloom. Don't get me wrong, because there is also a certain strength and a certain resolve that comes from that. Because you got to ask yourself, like, what tools can be used by the working class experience for them actually assuming power? This is like the ABCs of Marxism. And I think that question is harder to answer today because the working class is so fragmented from itself, right? But to me, that's where politics really has to be organized from. I think because liberalism doesn't care to have that class analysis, I think it misses every political worldview is itself a reflection of a limited social reality. It's a very interesting fact, I think, that philosophy and Hegel can teach us, which is that political communities also inculcate you in a kind of Weltanschauung, you know? And the worldview of liberalism, I can see its appeal. All I would say is that, perhaps over time that appeal may dissipate. As you see conditions deteriorate, I think the danger with liberalism is that its presuppositions will allow for the system to deteriorate and deteriorate. And there's no internal mechanisms in liberalism to truly institute transformative reforms to the system, especially in an American context. What liberals see as, first of all, the whole construct of reformism doesn't even it's not even a word that they would use. Reformism to what, right? It's a question of like the ambition and the scale, and like asking again, why are you constrained? Why do you see something? Why do I see a narrow constraint and you see like, well, that's just reality. That's just, right? That's an interesting difference. How do you account for that difference? Let me ask you. Or does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is something you have to take on. I think you have to take it on honestly, and that's why I don't like most liberals, I guess, because I do find that frustrating that there isn't an honest engagement with that, because I do think that, I can't say that I've experienced poverty or experienced it fully, but I absolutely am familiar enough with it to say that is a very big problem. I mean, I think the French book Germinal is very good for illustrating that concept. Obviously, that's literature, but past that. I think the problem is that I've just seen, I guess the way that I deal with that theoretically is that anecdotal evidence is very dangerous, because you can anecdotally justify anything, right? Because if you listen to Jordan Peterson, you're going to anecdotally realize you have to be a Christian, because Jordan Peterson can tell you all these stories about, not having God in your life, and how almost purely off the utility you need God. He's not even a Christian from any. I feel like that's the fundamental justification for him. He just thinks you have to be a Christian because it's good for your life, ultimately. And so I worry about anecdotal evidence like that, because I think if we look at what can end up happening is we look at a regime, and we say it could be any alternative, and we say this regime cares about poor people ideologically, and so they're superior to us because they actually care about poor people. And ultimately, the U.S. we don't care about the working class. It's always about the middle class here. We can never talk about less than middle class. That's very frustrating. It's always about the middle class. But but if we look at the actual evidence, I mean, what country is better for poor people? It seems to me that liberal democracy has created the best outcomes for the working class so far, inarguably, right? So what I want to do is I I just feel like we have to start there. We have to acknowledge that no matter what our ideological leaning is, there is a objectively better system. But then once you do that, as a liberal, I think you have to be honest with yourself that there are limits. And I feel like my entire project is to push that to the greatest it can be pushed, because I truly
I
would
see.
rather live in a system where the working class isn't treated the way it is right now, because I think it is a problem. And actually, one of the things that bothers me about liberals generally is they have policies like, the obsession over like student debt forgiveness, and that policy has always bothered me because that is a word that's a middle class policy. Like that's a middle class policy. It's not helping people get to college. It's just saying let's just relieve a bunch of college students right now to get more voters. I guess it's purely like cynical middle class politics.
Well,
Where
I actually disagree with that point. I think in regards to that point, the only promise of social freedom that liberal democracy really allows or permits is this really what you used to call like what we used to call, I think more appropriately, the Horatio Alger myth, which was actually founded right when the Republican Party was founded in the 1830s, 1840s, which is the idea that actually the the plebeian, the underclass, the working class, whatever you want to call it. Of course, I think working class is more coherent. Actually, this system does promise that through hard work and grit, you will be capable of attaining an equality that will give you certain provisions. And those provisions change as the overall possibility of the system changes. It's always been tied to property ownership, though. That's always been its guarantee. But, for example, after the Second World War, it was the nuclear family. You had, after the Second World War, 60% of Americans were basically exposed to a middle class way of life. I would actually contend that, part of what Trumpism is a great reaction to the three generations since World War II that have steadily seen the decompartmentalization of those promises kind of being taken away from people, right? As it pertains to the college loan forgiveness, first of all, in order for the system to serve that promise, it had to be done because the debt holders were themselves people largely from working class backgrounds in most cases, seeking to transcend those conditions. Kind of introduces an interesting point apropos socialism and revolution, which is, could you conceive of a vision, a myth of socialism, right? That's tied to a theory of revolution in which the promise is an overcoming of the system. Of course, part of what the logic of the ruling class wants is to inculcate a fear that any revolution like that will be so destabilizing, so unworth it to you, produce so much violence that rationally you do not have the power to control society. You do not. Because again, I think when push comes to shove, liberalism, liberal political figures have an ambiguous relationship to who it is that they are a ventriloquist of. It goes back to the question of interests. And I'm not sure that liberals have, I think if you brought 10 liberals into a room, you probably get 10 different answers about that question,
probably, yeah,
right? I think with socialists, what's interesting is that you actually probably would get like 9 times out of 10 a pretty coherent answer about that. Now, what you're saying is that, well, socialist states after the USSR have developed in such a way where they have a regressive worker state, right? Or a degenerative, what's it used to be called degenerative worker state, in which the whole coherence, and this is part of the reason why in China you had something like the Cultural Revolution. I don't know if you've studied it much. So, we've been through this. We know something about this. We know what it means for the working class to take power and then to assume that power over society. Let me tell you this. Those societies, Russia and China, also accelerated egalitarianism at rates far beyond what the US has ever done. I think in one sense you could define liberalism in the United States as always reacting to forces of the right and forces of the left and kind of trying to make a middle compromise out of it and then taking the credit for it when it's over. Say, for example, the New Deal. I don't think it's ever valid to say that the New Deal was like brought to us by liberals. I think that's historical inaccuracy. No, in reality, if you study the basis of class struggle, of the union struggle, of the presence of socialism in its organized form in Debs's party leading up to it, man, you will learn that the left, the socialist left, is hugely responsible for the achievement of the New Deal, right? Hugely responsible. As one example. So again, this notion of liberalism, what is liberalism? It becomes a mystery in a certain way. It becomes something that is like a kind of floating signifier in some cases. I mean, yeah, we can kind of define it, but it's also somewhat up for grabs. Because again, I would define it almost like as arbiter of the existing status quo. And I don't think that's adequate. You know, I mean, I admire what you're trying to do, and I think that it's good that you would be a critical liberal. But I think at a certain point, perhaps, we need to question the power of that label. Unless you, because you know what is also essential in what you're doing, is I think in order for you to have success, you'd have to have an intellectual movement of other liberal thinkers willing to actually stake down something much more concrete than currently is staked down about the world vision, the strategy, etc. I think liberalism is in a pretty profound crisis, right? Frankly, on many, many different levels. That's why I had to no longer be a liberal. It was just it's too contradictory for me.
Right. I mean, I think actually, I guess what I'm saying, and this goes back to the philosophical bedrock of it all. I think that's the strength of liberalism in a way. Is I guess I'm very skeptical of um, dogma and that sort of thing. And I think, like, Marxism has like kind of two sides to it, right? I mean, it can often be very critical, and you could argue that Marxism itself is a criticism of socialism, and it has this very critical instinct. But at the same time, it can definitely lean into dogma, as many things can. And I guess in some way you could define liberalism, or at least a part of it, as being against dogmas. I mean, that is one of the principled consistencies of liberalism, is that that is against dogma. Although you could say that in doing so, it's staking out certain dogmas against the other dogmas, sure. But I think that's a strength, because that seems to me, and again, this is philosophical bedrock, that seems to be consistent with the human experience.
Right.
It doesn't seem to me that, if we use the Cultural Revolution as an example, I mean, I don't think you can say the Cultural Revolution or China is a problem because the working class had too much power. There is kind of an inter-elite struggle going on there. There's a lot of levels to that, and I don't think you can simply say communism is evil. I mean, my point wasn't even that, like, the workers having too much power is bad. That wasn't even my point. My point is that cynically co-opting the workers just becomes another form of inter-elite struggle. And liberalism, in some sense, is being more honest about that. I mean, depending on the liberal, but at least I think the more respectable historical liberals and myself, we're being more honest, and we're saying, yeah, we are. I mean, we're elites talking about how society should run. That's what we are. But we're not cynically claiming to be, the using the working class, and then in that process creating something worse. And I mean, that's really what it always comes down to for me, is like, because I mean, I would absolutely agree that the Chinese Revolution created a lot of gains for society. But how do you account, for instance, for the fact that there was also a lot of economic, like, tragedy and complete disaster until Deng Xiaoping opened up the system and became more liberal. You would say. I think you have to understand Deng Xiaoping as a liberalizer. I'm not sure how you think about that, and I'm not super familiar with the more nuanced Marxist conception of Deng Xiaoping. But to me, I mean, I wrote a paper about this, an undergrad paper, so it's not the most well researched. But that really Deng Xiaoping is he's liberalizing the political system. He's putting in like term limits. He's adding in constraints on the power of the head of the office, and he's also opening up the economy, adding in capitalist influences, we could say. And I would argue that a huge portion of the reason that the Chinese people love the Communist Party is because of this moment in which the system was arguably becoming more liberal. So I would be curious to hear how you would deal with that example, or other examples if you have them.
I think in the case of the liberalization of China, it started really even with Mao, of course, and I think that the pre opening of markets period, the famine, the mismanagement, some of this is sort of reducible to, I think validly so, a lack of liberalization in the governing system itself and incompetence that would derive from that. I think that's totally valid. I think, though, at the same time, the achievements of the revolution allowed for a process of modernization to occur in the Chinese system, which, again, liberalism has a part to play in that, for sure. But keep in mind that the origin of the communist revolution in China was itself a contestation over an existing liberalism, which had grown decadent and which had abandoned its sort of mission to the people as well. So it's also culpable, right? So a lot of these things have to be taken in a historical point of view, and the fact that in some ways what kind of transformation of the Chinese peasantry was made possible by the Chinese Revolution, Communist Revolution, is remarkable. Not to mention the infrastructural development. I think the Deng Xiaoping period is interesting because we do have something like a kind of market communism, a highly regulated market communism at work here. I'm not an expert on it. I think I have where I think about it the most is in the way that American leftists, socialists, and communists interact with the Chinese experiment in the current state, where I worry that, in fact, it's not a relevant ideal for us for a whole host of reasons. And oftentimes it's sort of valorized as something greater than perhaps it really warrants to be. Its power is fetishized as well. So there's a lot of sort of China fetishization that I wish to avoid. I think in part because it's highly unlikely that a socialist movement in the U.S. would ever sort of seek its raison d'être or its ideological, putting aside its financial support from the Chinese government. I think if we did that, that would only actually put us in the pincers of the U.S. state and intelligence agencies, which is the last place we want to be in. As socialists, we need an independence from that, absolutely. But overall, I mean, I think it's quite interesting because there's a certain dichotomy, right? There's liberalism as degraded, decadent bourgeois bureaucrats who themselves end up inhabiting a system which is run amok. Then there's also liberalism as an abstract set of ideas for the kind of proper management of a system. And I think that is that latter version of liberalism, which can never be fully expressed in its pure abstract ideal form, in the same way that communism could never be fully expressed that way. It's almost like what you might call primitive liberalism, right? And I think the truth is that if you study the history of European liberalism and how the socialist movement interacted with it, it's a fundamentally fascinating story of immense sort of engagement one to the other, whereby what the socialist workers movement was constantly trying to remind liberals, which they often refused, was that actually liberalism was founded itself in a revolutionary expression. I don't know what you make of that, but it is, I think, true. And frankly, it probably represents a pretty profound contradiction at the heart of liberalism, which is, do we avow our own revolutionary origins or do we disavow our own revolutionary origins? That then becomes a question, because it's almost like a quasi-theological question, right? It's like, if we avow it, does it mean that we only had one revolution and this is it? Maybe more interesting would be, no, revolution, like Matt McManus, like revolutionary liberalism still may be fused with socialism. I'm much more skeptical of that. I think in order for that vision to work, and I haven't listened to your interview with Matt, I will do so, there would have to be some development of a liberal intelligentsia that would be capable of actually being convinced of that partnership. As it currently stands, I don't see any convincing like that possible, especially in the U.S. So my vision on China is, I mean, the Deng Xiaoping reforms are interesting. All I would say is that what I've studied of it, I think that the excesses of the Cultural Revolution have mediated, just as much as liberalism has mediated, a sort of balance of equality in the Chinese system and a kind of relative harmonization of Chinese society. And I think if you examine a lot of the indices of social health, the Chinese actually have a society which is steadily becoming much more appealing than ours. And I think probably will become more harmonious, more stable than ours moving forward. But again, whether that's owed to Mao, to the abolishment of peasantry, to the Cultural Revolution, or to liberalization, all of that has to be thought like together, I think, in a certain way. The final point I'll make is that I find it very interesting how anti-Chinese propaganda probably will be very difficult to get off the ground in the future in the U.S. because of the points I just made. And I you know what I mean? Like, a Red Scare that will inevitably pit China as some great other. I don't see young people falling for it. Do you know what I mean? I just don't
Maybe.
see it.
I think there are fundamental. I mean, I've never been interested in like naive anti-China rhetoric, but at the same time, I think there are fundamental aspects of the Chinese system that are not to be envied. I think the political oppression, political suppression of opposition and fundamental civil rights, I think is something that is very easy actually to use. Now, if you want to make arguments outside of those, it's going to be a lot harder. But I think those are fundamentally appealing to any person, including young people, and I think that is the most worrying thing about China, and the thing I would object to the most. But I mean, on
But
revolution,
again, let's tether with that point. I, I think we just got done talking about in a prior set of questions about the evacuation that is happening, I think, daily more so, the impossibility of that for young people, the impossibility of this, what you might call negative social freedom contract that undergirds the American experiment, right? More and more people are no longer compelled by how onerous it feels to actually assume that kind of freedom, right? Because there is so many forces that are put in your way as obstacles on the one hand, from the cost of living crisis to the cost of college and higher education to the decline in real wages, to the real estate market, and on and on and on, for which there seems to be no end in sight. I mean, the basis by which a transformation would occur socialistically, let's say, would have to be able to tap into that desire. Socialists would have to be able to acknowledge with a straight face that that desire is something distinct to Americans. Namely, that early desire to become someone who can have these promises realized for yourself. It may sound like a cliche, but in fact, it is fulfilling. I'm saying this as somebody who grew up in a working class background and kind of has achieved a lot of these things. You know myself. Um, and the way I achieved them never something like somebody gave it to me, but I had to fight for it. It's fulfilling, it's humbling, but it's also like when I think back, I'm like, it was hard. And I think that a lot of people are not, we're having a certain crisis over the difficulty of achieving those ideals. And that is a materialist crisis, I'm sorry to say, right? I don't know how you see that, but it's just real to me.
Maybe I just think that you can never. I think civil liberties exist for a reason. I don't think you can. I don't think you can disregard them entirely. Um, I think if you, I mean, all you would need to do. I mean, actually, you can see this in that a huge portion of the opposition to Trump and the fear about Trump is a deprivation of civil liberties. It's not about material conditions, right? I mean, the fear about Trump for a lot of people is going to be arbitrary deportation without due process, a suppression of freedom of speech in the way that he's dealing with colleges and punishing them for allowing freedom of speech to take place, or that sort of thing. I mean, these are some of the biggest problems that with Trump is that he's depriving civil liberties. It's not about material
Okay, now
conditions.
let's, this is really interesting you say that, because doesn't that immediately link back to what we said about the Bonapartist as full of rhetorical flourishes that circumvent or sort of go around the undergirding material dimension of politics? In other words, bourgeois politics has certain unsaid rules that compose what's permissible to be said within its arena, right? The Bonapartist figure breaks those rules, but they do so in the service of a transgression of those rules in a kind of vulgar and obscene way. I think a socialist would break those rules with an eye towards the material dimension, right? You see, that's the thing about desire. Desire, right, is like socially constructed. The fact that people don't talk about material interests doesn't mean that that's not what drives people.
Right.
It means that systems of power have created parameters that don't allow you to do it.
Well, I think that's fair, but I think we also have to acknowledge that civil liberties themselves are directly connected to material conditions. I mean, after all, if you can't speak against your state and they can
Oh,
just
that I agree
take
with.
property, then that is directly. I mean, I don't think these are disconnected at all. These,
That I completely agree with. They're not disconnected, but I think that they're exaggerated. That's evidenced by certain sort of hysterical examples that emerge, which, like, if we take like the trans rights debates, my contention there would be um, that what we're dealing with is something which is often internalized by the right as actually constituting the same level of existential threat to them as it feels for the trans experience. So it's kind of like they mimic an intensity which is fundamentally hyperbolic, fundamentally off of kilter, right? And then that then becomes kind of like the point of a sort of degraded culture war thing, which ultimately just sort of takes all of the oxygen out of the arena of politics itself. So I do think that these things are tied to material interests without question, but I think that they get opportunistically rerouted as basically like either avoidance operations. Um, I mean, it does actually bear some thinking about how the closest figure we obviously got to this sort of material interest centric rhetoric is obviously Bernie Sanders. And I think at that level of rhetoric, he does have a lot to teach us. Not at the level of like how he construed policy, but I'm talking about what the conditions that allowed Sanders to enter into the arena and speak in this way. That's what is must be learned by the left, you know? I don't think liberals want to learn anything from Sanders because ideologically, they don't have any solidarity with Sanders. Would you agree with that? Or
Um,
would you agree with that for yourself?
I, I feel like there's a yes and a no there. Like, no, in the sense that I don't agree with some of his assumptions and sort of his like lack of. I don't think he cares about liberalism either. I don't think he cares about certain principles that I care about. But in the sense that he wants to better society and honestly grapple with systemic issues and push past them, I think liberals absolutely have to have solidarity with him there. I think you have to be able to see beyond yourself and challenge yourself in that way. I mean, I think there is a yes and a no there. Um, which is why you can actually see a lot of Democrats using Sanders' language. But I just think the whole thing is kind of corrupt from the start because none of them are just engaging with it honestly, I guess. Um, I did want to make a point about China, though, which is that while China is making a lot of gains, I think what you're not accounting for is the harm that is done to their population that would include material conditions by their lack of civil rights. I mean, I would say the reason you aren't as familiar with the plight of the working class in China is because you don't hear about it because they don't have as honest of a uh, they just suppress all of that dissent. But I'm quite certain that there are very underdeveloped, very stagnant areas of China that are taken for granted in the same way that we take them for granted in liberalism. They're just not honest about it, not as honest about it. I don't think that's I would question empirically whether or not they're really
I
transcending
was
that
sort of
problem.
trying to suggest the same thing, that I'm opposed to the project that some leftists have of Chinese idealization. I'm not a Chinese idealist
Right.
at all. I think there are strategic lessons about Maoism that I am critical of as it expressed itself through May 68 thought, through France after the war, which became subsequently hugely influential in left wing American academia, for example. Something I've written, this is a topic I've written about extensively, and sort of Western Maoism. Um, it has a very interesting record that is worth like interrogating and worth understanding. I think for contemporary China, um, I'm not actually sure how the socialist movement should relate to China. I think for one thing I know for sure is that I'm adamantly opposed to what will happen, which is the intensification of imperialist rivalry with China.
Right.
And I think that this we can count on and rely on as a systemic uh, surety, with some degree of surety, that the U.S. ruling class, both parties, will pursue an aggressive position vis-a-vis China, which again is mostly uh, kind of an expression, I think, of the dominance of world markets. And again, you have to ask, what is your theory of imperialism, right? And I think that the Marxist theory of imperialism, as Lenin develops it, is actually extremely powerful, um, because it gives us a kind of predictive model for understanding. It's not just like this kind of Chomskyan view where sort of uh, it's necessarily driven either by like elite psychopathic mandarins combined with their material interests. But I think that uh, Lenin allows us to see imperialism as a sort of uh, process whereby capitalism enters into a kind of final stage of nation state rivalries, and then a whole series of effects are kicked up, which again have a degree of kind of predictability embedded in them and so on. I've been writing about Lenin's theory of imperialism lately. I'm very compelled by it. So we need to avoid the future war with China that needs to be fundamentally rejected. And I think more cultural cooperation with China should be engaged in. Um, and I don't know. I mean, I think that liberalism itself, I don't know how it's going to get out of the kind of intellectual crisis that it finds itself in. Um, I'm happy that you're thinking through these things, although I'm not convinced of what I would consider to be your agnosticism here. Because I think this position on dogmatism, isn't that just agnosticism? if
Um,
effectively,
I
which is
mean,
fine if it is. But if it is, like, where's agency? That's my problem with agnosticism. It's like, again, it's like a worldview which is content with status quo maintenance, which is something that you want liberalism to not be. So I would just ask you, like, are you an agnostic ultimately, where you think that, like, no dogmatism is good? This is like, so, like, what actually are you doing? Are you sort of like, I don't know, like, it seems too wishy-washy for me. I'm not claiming that on you, but I'm just saying, like, the fundamental system does.
no, I think that's fair. I just think that, um, well, first of all, like I said, I mean, on philosophical bedrock, I mean, I am very, I guess, agnostic. I mean, you could, I think that is a huge part of how I view the world, just fundamentally philosophically, is I just think that's the case. Like, I'm not against dogmatism principally. I think you could have a correct dogmatism. I'm just not convinced that we can or ever have proven a correct dogmatism, and so as such, I'm against dogmatism because I haven't.
Well, Marxism is against dogmatism too, by the way, because Marx had a very interesting um, debate once with a fellow socialist by the name of Arnold Ruge, and he effectively was asked, um, should we as Marxists impose our principles on others? And Marx's response was, no, we shouldn't. We should rather effectively teach others' struggles why it is they are struggling, right? It's kind of a philosophical answer. I kind of like it, Marxism is, in that sense, according to Lukács, defined by its relationship to an understanding of totality, meaning that the strength of the Marxist view is that it can distill the logic of the world system, of capitalist world system, as a totality, as a kind of like a unified knowable entity, in a certain sense. That's not to say, like, in the Hegelian idea, of course, immediately you think of like absolute knowledge or the end of the phenomenology, for example. That's a whole separate debate. It doesn't mean that the proletariat becomes omniscient. No, it just means that dialectical materialism has a fundamental openness to an understanding of society as a social metabolic system that's also like naturalist. It's like a naturally organic system, which is constantly going through changes. But there is also the capacity to superimpose a theory of the laws of that system, right? Engels would say one can do that within nature. I'm not so sure. Um, the Dialectics of Nature is a very
Right.
interesting book by Engels in this regard. But I think all Marxists would have to make this claim about history, right? Um, then, of course, you get into the debate. Well, then, does the Marxist view on history mean that we are all committed to some teleological vision? And it's very interesting because, Althusser, the French Marxist, tried to expunge all traces of teleology from Marxism because
Right.
one of his claims was is that teleology ends up becoming the expression ultimately of bourgeois individualism. Very interesting argument. In other words, bourgeois individualism, in Hegel's philosophy and his dialectical vision, is always kind of like uh, that which is repeated. It's kind of like this idea that you get in Hegel of like the world spirit on horseback of Napoleon
Mm-hmm.
in the phenomenology. Althusser seems to think that, like, that's what the proletariat becomes in Marx. And so he's like, well, we need to just get rid of Hegelian Marxism
Right.
entirely, right? And I'm not so sure about that, right? I think there's a way in which Hegelian Marxism can kind of construe of the proletariat. A phrase that Marx used for it is as the ensemble of social relations. Like, you think of like a musical ensemble. And so in that sense, it's not about like the personification of like some singular personage. Because this was actually a huge debate that Marx had with the anarchist figure Proudhon. And Proudhon basically thought that classes ultimately are kind of like reducible to persons. They're kind of like personifications.
Right.
And Marx's theory of class is not like that at all, which kind of brings us back in a curious way to this debate about Bonapartism and fetishization of the individual, the ruler, etc. But no, I mean, I don't think all of that is to say is that Marxism is dialectical. It's not dogmatic. Sorry for that digression, but I think that, um, but it is decisive. It is decisive. It is, it is therefore a kind of decisive belief. Like one, I think, becomes a Marxist in a decisive act. Like, you know what I mean? It's, to me, it's like liberalism is not like that. I've never met a liberal who had like a conversionary decisive act come into liberalism. Maybe you have. Maybe that's happened actually from people on the right that go to liberals. Maybe it has. I don't know. It's just not how it works for me. Because liberalism is just like so associated with the status quo and with kind of the maintenance of the everyday. It's hard for me to be compelled by it.
Yeah, what's interesting actually is that a couple points. Number one, that feeling you just mentioned about status quo,
Yeah.
I'm actually very sympathetic to that. In fact, that's kind of a point that I tried to make to Matt McManus, is that I felt like he had that problem, that he was too kind of focused on and controlled by the status quo, that he wasn't able to see past that, and that's why I
That's
actually
interesting.
I know
Wait. Isn't he supposed to say that to you?
you could think that, but I don't know. I mean, I just have this sense that when I talk to certain people, I think you could absolutely apply it to me. I guess I'm kind of stuck in where I see the both sides, and I tried to bring this up to him, and that like I don't know how to reconcile them. I really don't,
Right.
because I do think that's a problem with what he says. And I was about to say the other point I want to make is that that is what is compelling about Marxism to me, is this sense of history. And this,
Yeah.
I've heard the critique that liberals don't understand history, and I think that's fair. And I do feel like I have learned a lot from the Marxist conception of history and
Right.
a lot of the
Me
things you're
too.
describing. So I do appreciate that, but I just I still feel that it's deceptive, that totalizing tendency. I don't know, it just seems deceptive to me. But I mean, I guess this is really philosophical bedrock, which is actually why I wanted to ask you at the end here, because you mentioned at the beginning that there's a debate about the role of philosophy in Marxism.
Yeah.
Um, and so I want to ask you, like, because it sounds to me like philosophy is important to you. You do think it matters. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the most important, like, philosophical positions that you have to take before Marxism, you could say? I guess Hegel's the obvious one, but I'd like to hear you a little bit more of what you think about that, just to end off here about philosophy and what that means to you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I suppose I would say that one must be a resolute materialist. And by materialist, I think that I understand that. There's many ways to understand that. But how I understand it primarily is through a social historical perspective, meaning that um, social reality is fundamentally constituted out of uh, a social bedrock in which, like, social relations um, provide sort of like the basis by which we can alter reality itself. So reality itself um, is not something fully grounded in the mind, like the Bishop Berkeley would argue. It's something exterior to us. That's the key point about materialism, is that reality and mind is constituted in an exteriority. It's constituted in society. So therefore, the task of the philosopher is not necessarily to be like a sociologist, but it is to have an understanding that there is a sort of reflexivity about consciousness coming into a realization of society and of the social itself. Um, So that would be, I think, point number one. I think on the question of God, atheism, and religion, my view would be that a Marxist and socialist vision would not be exclusive to religious practitioners at all, but would but it would be necessary to, I think, show that materialism, in many ways, as a philosophical system, would short circuit the general coherence of religious worldviews, founded as they are off of a lot of supernatural myths. So there's a way in which we can describe those supernatural myths and the social efficacy and rationale by which they were internalized and incorporated. They have they speak to very particular forms of social deprivation and social suffering that are kind of pre-Enlightenment expressions. And so, in a certain way, I think it's very interesting to examine German idealism in this way, because all of the German idealists were basically like believed in essence that God had subsumed in nature, right? And in that sense, sort of like uh, I myself fall in line with that kind of German idealist relationship to Christianity. I fall in line with this vision that Christianity has an emancipatory tradition, that Christianity can actually be read, and that the kingdom of heaven, for example, can be read as like an imminent yearning of the proletariat in history, right? There's like a way to sort of like retroactively understand um, the history of all hitherto societies as histories of class struggle, um, with a lot of exceptions. And I think it's a very important notion, therefore, to sort of periodize moments of human freedom. So history is actually about the gradual opening of human freedom. I think that Aristotle is absolutely essential in any analysis of Marxism, because Aristotle puts forward an ethics of human flourishing and the maximization of human happiness at the very center. I think that the Platonic legacy is more ambiguous, because Neoplatonism breaks off and fuses with Christianity and becomes something very distinct. So the idea of like philosophical systems being thought in pure isolation is kind of not how Marxists would see philosophical systems. Like there's no pure Augustinian system. No, it's like a system has gone through all of these um, historical moments of integration into social systems of power and dominance, and they have to be thought
Right.
accordingly. Um, so that's what I would say about religion. That's what I would say about materialism. I mean, there's also the question of like atomism and like the pure metaphysics of materialism, which is worth looking into. Like, I think Lucretius is a very important figure to study, um, of thinking at this like the fundamental notions of how change is possible at a molecular level and things of that nature, and these more abstract scientific questions. And I think the other question would be science itself. What is your theory, not only of science, but of science's purchase on truth? And I think here psychoanalysis has a very interesting relationship to science, insofar as one of my kind of philosophical mentors, Jacques Lacan, will end up making a kind of argument, right? That there's kind of like a distinction between truth as science versus truth as a kind of, um, it's a very Hegelian idea, as a sort of expression of social error. This like truth actually reveals itself at the moment when everything collapses and breaks down. Something very different than scientific truth. So I think there's that also, and this is also tied into existentialism. So you ask me like what philosophical systems, I could just keep on listing the importance of all of them in a certain way, because I think that all of them have to be assessed through a concept I like called the balance sheet. where it's kind of like this notion that if you have a historical materialist analysis, you can take a system of thought and sort of analyze it, not only its core doctrines, but like how actually, like take Stoicism. Stoicism has a history of being used as like the justification of like rulers and elites. That's just as interesting as like what certain, like what Seneca would say in his meditation. So everything has to be seen as it is, like a lived experience. Like, you know what I'm saying? Um, Socrates becomes the model, I think, of how education is to function for me. The Socratic method is similar to the Freudian method of free association, seems very simple. But actually, if you look at like what Freud meant by free association, for example, you will be amazed at the richness in which scientific claims are capable of being generated from conditions in which free association is possible. Lacan thought that you could actually create kind of an artificial environment in which human language and speech produces a kind of relay system that allows you to interrogate the unconscious purely through speaking in free association. So there's like a highly elaborate way that works. Now, I think with Socratic method, you should never underestimate its power either, just as a pure mode of interrogation into arriving at ultimately the impossibility of truth. If you read the dialogues, it's like this maddening thing because it's like, yeah, it's like no social position seems to have a corner on the truth in a certain way. So there's so much. I mean, I think Marxism and philosophy in the Soviet period had developed a bad reputation for itself of being rigid and of being dogmatic. For example, are you aware that they banned Hegel for many years?
No, I didn't know that.
I didn't know when my hand went up. Sorry about that. They banned Hegel. The censorship, right? I've grown to be a huge critic of censorship. That's not something we've talked about. So, you know, everything needs to be thrown onto the table. Yeah, I mean, I would say analytic philosophy, but I'm not really sure what that is. There's a new book about called The Social History of Analytic Philosophy, where that's kind of the argument, which is you say analytic philosophy, but like, what are the coherent foundational points that tie analytic philosophy? It's actually not, it's actually super contradictory, kind of like liberalism. um, so there's so much I can say about philosophy. And I guess I'll stop there. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, no, I really appreciate hearing you put some of those out there because I did want to talk about a lot of that more and we didn't get to it as much, but that's okay. I do appreciate hearing that more. And
What else did you want to talk about?
more to investigate. Just some of the more of the specifics on those, like Lacan and just some more specifics on each of those points you raised. But
yeah, we can do a future thing on like psychoanalysis and Freud and Lacan if you're interested. I mean, I've done a lot of work in that area. I've written a book on it and frequently teach it. So I'll be
right,
happy to pursue that if you're so interested. I have a full seminar on an introduction to Freudian Marxism that may interest you. Um,
right,
I may actually turn it into a book where it's kind of like, you know, introducing the major figures, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, you know,
yeah,
uh, Deleuze and Guattari. So, yeah.
yeah, that sounds interesting. I'll have to look at some more of those. And yeah, I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation and exploring some of these things with you. I really appreciate you. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming. Enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
Dylan.
Yeah.
It's been very enjoyable.
All right.
Happy to come on again. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching.